She's not really family. She just married in. That's what my sister-in-law said to the funeral director, 3 feet away from me, like I was a coat rack instead of a widow. I want to tell you about my husband, Daniel Voss. Staff sergeant, 2 tours, 1 Purple Heart, and the only man who ever made me feel like I belong somewhere. But if I start there, you won't understand why I was standing in a funeral home in Toledo, Ohio, in a black dress I bought 2 days earlier, listening to his sister explain to a stranger that I didn't count. Her name is Renata, Daniel's older sister. She had not called me once in the 11 days between the accident and the funeral. Not once. But she showed up that morning in a coat that still had the tags tucked under the collar, and she stood at the casket like she'd been the one holding his hand every night for 6 years. She's not really family, Renata said again, quieter this time, like she thought I couldn't hear the second version any better than the first. Danny married her because he was lonely after Afghanistan. That's not the same as family. I didn't say anything. I want you to understand that. I had every right to scream in that room. I had 11 days of grief sitting in my chest like wet sand, and I did not let 1 ounce of it out. I looked at the funeral director, a kind older man named Mr. Okafor, and I said, "Which line do you need me to sign?" That was it. That was my whole response. Not today, I told myself. Not here. Not over his body. I met Daniel when I was 26, working the night shift at a VA outpatient clinic in Dayton. He came in for a shoulder that never healed right, and he made a joke about the parking lot being harder to survive than Kandahar. I laughed before I meant to. He asked for my number like he'd been planning it the whole appointment. We got married 11 months later at the county courthouse. No big wedding, just his best friend Marcus as witness, and my mother crying into a tissue she'd brought from home because she said she knew she'd need it. Renata didn't come to the courthouse. She sent a card 2 weeks later that said, "Congratulations, I guess," and nothing else. That was the first sign, if I'd been looking for signs. I wasn't. I was 27 and in love, and I didn't think I needed Daniel's family to approve of anything. For 6 years, I was the one who lived it. Not the holidays, not the photos, the actual, unglamorous, day in day out of loving a man who came home from war with pieces of himself still overseas. I filled his prescriptions every month. The same pharmacy, same face behind the counter who knew my name before she knew his. I sat with him during 3 panic attacks that came out of nowhere, once in a grocery store parking lot, once at 2 in the morning, once during his own mother's birthday dinner while his family ate cake in the next room. I learned to recognize the specific way his jaw tightened before he needed to leave a room, and I would just stand up and say we had somewhere to be, no explanation, because he didn't need an audience for that. I paid the electric bill the months his disability check was late. I drove him to 11 VA appointments in 1 year alone. I signed the forms. I sat in waiting rooms with bad coffee and worse magazines. I learned the names of his doctors, his caseworker, the pharmacist, the guy at the VFW post who checked on him when I couldn't. I did this. I did that. I made him dinner on nights he couldn't talk. I held the phone when he called his mother, because she liked me less on the phone than in person, somehow. I remembered his father's death date every year, and made sure we visited the grave, even the year Renata didn't. I stood outside a hospital room for 6 hours during his gallbladder surgery, and didn't call anyone in his family, because I didn't want to hear their voices while I was scared. Renata's version of love was a Christmas card and a Facebook comment. It was showing up for the parts that photographed well, and disappearing for the parts that didn't. She came to his 40th birthday party for 45 minutes, and left before the cake. She called on his birthday most years, though not the year he was hospitalized for the pneumonia that almost took him early. She said family means everything to her. She said it at every gathering, usually while doing very little of it. I'm not telling you this to make myself sound like a saint. I'm telling you because 6 weeks after the funeral, I found out that none of it mattered to some people. Not the 6 years. Not the appointments. Not the nights on the bathroom floor holding him while he shook. To Renata, I would always just be the woman who married in. The accident was quick, at least. A drunk driver ran a light on Route 25 at 6:40 in the morning. Daniel was on his way to a job site. He did HVAC work by then, said it felt good to fix something that stayed fixed. He was 41 years old. He left the house that morning with coffee in a thermos I bought him for our anniversary, and he never got where he was going. I won't skip ahead now, because grief doesn't move in a straight line, and neither does this story. For weeks after the funeral, I got a call from a man named Arthur Bell. He introduced himself as an estate attorney out of Columbus, said he'd handled some paperwork for Daniel 2 years earlier, and needed to meet with me. I assumed it was routine. Insurance, a will, the small things people leave behind. I did not expect what happened in that office. Mr. Bell was maybe 60, silver-haired, the kind of calm that comes from decades of delivering hard news gently. He sat me down with a folder in front of him and said, "Daniel came to me in March 2 years ago. He wanted to make some changes, and he wanted them airtight. 2 years ago. That was after the pneumonia hospitalization. After the week the doctors weren't sure he'd pull through. I remembered that week clearly. I remembered him being quiet for days afterward, thoughtful in a way that worried me more than the illness had." Mr. Bell opened the folder. Inside was a will, updated and notarized, naming me not just as beneficiary, but as sole trustee of a family trust one didn't know existed. A trust holding his VA survivor benefit structuring, a small life insurance policy, and, more importantly, controlling interest in a piece of property that had belonged to his late father. Land that Renata had spent years assuming, out loud, at every family dinner, would eventually be split between her and Daniel. Land she'd already mentioned, more than once, that she planned to sell. But there was something else in the folder. A letter. Handwritten, for pages, dated the same week as the trust documents. Mr. Bell let me read it alone. He stepped out of the room and closed the door, and I sat there in a leather chair that smelled like old paper, and I read my husband's handwriting for what I knew, somehow, was one of the last times I'd see something new from him. I'm not going to recite the whole letter to you. Some of it is mine to keep. But I'll tell you the parts that matter to this story. He wrote that the hospital scared him. Not the illness itself, but the quiet after, lying there at 2 a.m. thinking about what would happen to the people he loved if he didn't wake up one of those nights. He wrote that he'd watched his family for years, watched Renata show up for the version of him that made a good photo and disappear for the version that needed help getting off the bathroom floor. He wrote, "My family loves the idea of me. Only one person has ever loved the actual, difficult, 3 a.m. version of me, and that's my wife." He wrote that he wanted to protect me, not just financially, but from being erased. He used that word, erased. He said he'd heard the way his mother and sister talked about our marriage when they thought he wasn't listening, and he wanted it on paper, permanently, undeniably, exactly who had shown up. He named me trustee of everything. Not because I asked. Not because I knew. Because he'd been paying attention the entire time I thought I was the only one doing the noticing. I sat in that office and cried for the first time since the funeral. Not the composed, hallway kind of crying. The real kind. Mr. Bell walked me through what it meant in practical terms. As trustee, I had legal authority over the property and the associated funds, with instructions from Daniel on distribution, a portion set aside for his mother's ongoing care, a smaller portion for a nephew's college fund, and the rest designated to stay with me, the house, and any future the letter said he hoped I'd still get to have. Renata was named in the trust for exactly nothing. Daniel had written in his own hand that he loved his sister, but that love and trust were not the same thing, and he'd learned the difference the hard way. I didn't tell anyone right away. I sat with it for 2 weeks, because I wanted to be sure I wasn't misreading anything, and because some small, tired part of me knew what was coming the moment Renata found out. She found out the way most people find out things they don't want to hear. Someone else told her first. A cousin who worked in the same county records office noticed the trust filing and mentioned it at a family cookout, thinking it was just interesting news. By that evening, my phone had 14 missed calls. I picked up on the 15th. "There's obviously been some kind of mistake," Renata said. "No hello, no how are you doing. Daniel wouldn't cut his own family out. You must have pressured him. Sick people get confused, you know. Vulnerable." I stayed quiet for a second, because I wanted to make sure my voice didn't shake when I answered. "He wasn't confused, Renata. He was in a hospital bed thinking clearly about who actually shows up for him. That land was supposed to be split between us," she said. "Everyone knew that. It was understood." "It wasn't in writing," I said. "The thing that's in writing is the letter he left explaining why it isn't." There was a pause, and then she said the line I will remember for the rest of my life. "You were his charity case, and now you think you're his widow. There's a difference." I hung up. I didn't scream. I didn't cry, not that time. I just set the phone down on the counter and stood in my kitchen for a long time, looking at the thermos still sitting in the dish rack because I hadn't been able to put it away yet. 2 weeks later, Renata's lawyer sent a formal challenge to the trust, alleging undue influence, the legal phrase for exactly what she'd accused me of on the phone. She wanted the will thrown out. She wanted the property reassessed and split under a version of fairness that existed only in her head. And through her attorney, she made an offer. Settle privately, hand over 60% of the property's value, and she'd let the matter go quietly for the family's sake. I want you to sit with that phrase. For the family's sake. As if silence was ever what protected this family. As if quiet was something she'd ever chosen before it benefited her. I told my attorney no. Mr. Bell had warned me this might happen, and he'd already started building the file we'd need. Daniel's hospital record showing full mental competency at the time of the letter, the notarized signatures, a statement from the notary herself confirming Daniel had come in alone, calm, and clear about what he wanted. Mr. Bell had also, quietly, kept a running record over 2 years of every time Daniel mentioned the trust to him in follow-up calls, reaffirming it, never once wavering. The case went to a probate hearing 5 months after Daniel died. Renata sat across the room from me with her husband and her lawyer, and for the first time since the funeral home, we were in the same space with witnesses. Her attorney tried to paint a picture of a grieving, medicated veteran who'd been steered by a wife eager for financial gain. It might have worked if there'd been anything behind it. But Mr. Bell walked the judge through 2 years of consistent documentation. The notary testified that Daniel had joked with her about wanting his paperwork tighter than his last deployment. The hospital record showed no cognitive impairment, no medication that would have clouded judgment, nothing but a man who'd had a scare and decided to act on what mattered to him. And then Renata's own attorney made a mistake that ended up mattering more than anything I could have said. Trying to establish that Renata had been a devoted, present sister, he asked her to describe her involvement in Daniel's care over the years. She started listing holidays. Photos. The birthday card she'd sent the year he was hospitalized with pneumonia. The year she never actually visited. The judge, a soft-spoken woman named Judge Alvarez who had clearly read every page of the file, asked one quiet question. Ms. Voss, were you aware your brother was hospitalized in March 2 years ago? Renata said yes. Did you visit him during the hospitalization? There was a pause. A long one. The kind of pause where you can hear the room breathing. I was very busy that month, Renata said. The silence after that answer sealed the room. Nobody moved. Nobody whispered. I watched something shift in Judge Alvarez's face, the particular stillness of someone who's just heard everything they needed to hear. The ruling came 2 weeks later in writing. The trust stood, fully and completely, exactly as Daniel had written it. The judge's opinion specifically noted, in her own words, that the evidence showed consistent, sustained caregiving by the petitioner's wife over a period of years, contrasted with sporadic and self-reported involvement by the contesting party. Renata's challenge was dismissed. She was also, under the terms already written into the trust, responsible for her own legal fees, a detail Daniel had apparently anticipated might be necessary, because he'd added a clause specifying that any unsuccessful challenge would forfeit even the small courtesy gift he'd originally set aside for her, a token he'd written for my sister, if she ever needs it and asks with an open hand. She never got the token. She never asked with an open hand. She lost the case, lost the property claim, and lost. I heard through Daniel's mother, who called me crying about a month later, apologizing for things she should have said years earlier. Most of what was left of her relationship with the rest of the family, who had watched the whole hearing and drawn their own conclusions. I didn't feel triumphant when it was over. I want to be honest about that. I felt tired, mostly, the way you feel after carrying something heavy for a long time and finally getting to set it down. I visit Daniel's grave most Sundays. I still bring the same coffee he used to take with him to work, and I sit on the little folding chair I keep in my trunk, and I talk to him like he can hear me, because some days I believe he can. Last Sunday I told him about the ruling. I told him his sister still hasn't called. I told him the nephew's college fund is already growing, untouched, waiting for a kid who has no idea yet what his uncle did for him. I told him the thermos is finally back in the cabinet instead of the dish rack, which took me longer than I want to admit. Here's what I've come to understand, sitting on that folding chair more Sundays than I can count. Love isn't the version of yourself you perform for a room. It's the version of yourself that shows up when no one's watching, when it's inconvenient, when it's 3 a.m. and there's no applause coming. Daniel knew the difference between the two, even when he was the one who needed help the most. And in the end, he made sure the truth outlived the performance. That's my story. If you've ever been the one who actually showed up, for a parent, a partner, a friend, while someone else got the credit for showing up less. Tell me about it in the comments. I read every one. And if this is your first time hearing one of these, stick around. I got more stories like this one, and I think you'll want to hear them.